Welcome to my dear brother, Dr. Munzaya. Sorry, I was just running through some housekeeping, but we are now firmly in your hands. You can take us home. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So welcome everyone to the third and final session where we'll be discussing criminology. My name's Leo. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Private Law, and I'll be your chair. Sorry in advance if there's construction noise. The council's relaying the pavement about 5 meters that way, which is convenient. Yeah, so we're talking about criminology, and we'll be hearing from Andrew, Matthew, and Annie. Thanks to all of you for being brave and for the hard work I'm sure you've been putting into your presentation. And thanks to Kelly Moult also, who'll be our discussant. I would also like to applaud Sept. Probably others have already done so today, but yeah, I think this initiative's the faculty will really benefit, and I know he's put in a lot of hard work organizing it. My main task is just to keep all of the speakers ruthlessly to time. So I think we have 20 minutes for each speaker, and then 10 minutes for Kelly to respond. And yeah, I'll have to be very serious about that, so everyone gets a chance. I will use the chat function to convey to the speakers the time they have left. I'll give you a 10-minute warning, a 5-minute warning, a 2-minute warning, and then a wrap up right now, or I'll have to rudely butt in to cut you off. Yeah, so I hope the chat function won't be intrusive while you're presenting, but you'll have to keep one eye on it. Okay, thanks. So first up, I think we've got Andrew talking about halfway houses.
Am I good to go?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Privileged to be here. I liked what Professor Mostert said at the beginning about the advantage of being a full-time student, because this project of mine is evidence of both the danger and the opportunity of being a very part-time student. On the positive side, I've spent about 20 years in this space of prisoner rehabilitation, listening to prisoners across 7 countries. But on the negative side, I have developed about every different kind of procrastination mechanism possible to keep me from writing, including 3 children, 2 jobs, and founding a company. So I am the master of procrastination, but I'm excited because this is the year. There is light at the end of the tunnel. I plan to have a final draft by the end of this year, so I can submit at the next session. So I'm really excited to be here. The context of my research is society's perverse and lasting fascination with incarceration. To emphasize that, I'm gonna read 2 quotes from my research. The first is a very old one from going back to 1842. Charles Dickens, in addition to being one of the most published novelists of all time, was an avid progressive social reformer of the day, and he visited Eastern Penitentiary in the United States, which is in many ways the birthplace of the modern prison, a total institution with a veneer of rehabilitation. It's been copied more than 300 times all over the world, and it was in operation until the 1970s. But he visited this prison, and he observed their pioneering use of isolation, solitary confinement, which is the strongest definition or example of a prison's power on an institutional basis. And Dickens writes, I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony which this dreadful punishment, prolonged for years, inflicts upon the sufferers. And in guessing at it myself, and in reasoning from what I have seen written upon their faces, and what to my certain knowledge they feel within, I am only the more convinced that there is a depth of terrible endurance in it which none but the sufferers themselves can fathom, and which no man has a right to inflict upon his fellow teacher, his fellow creature. So that's from the 1840s. Now jumping forward to 2016, there's a more quantitative analysis as presented by Atul Gawande, who has done some great scholarship about how solitary confinement is still at the center of prison as an institution. And he references Stuart Gracian, a Boston psychiatrist, has interviewed more than 200 prisoners in solitary confinement. In one in-depth study prepared for a legal challenge of prisoner isolation practices, he concluded that about a third developed acute psychosis with hallucinations. The markers of vulnerability he observed in his interviews were signs of cognitive dysfunction, a history of seizures, serious mental illness, mental retardation, illiteracy, or as in one prisoner's case, a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In these prisoners, Gracian saw about a third had these vulnerabilities, and these were the prisoners whom solitary confinement had made psychotic. They were not simply cognitively equipped to endure without mental breakdowns. And I read these quotes from either end of a 200-year span to show that Atul Gawande, writing in 2016, is just as appalled at the prison industrial complex as Charles Dickens was in the 1840s. And yet we still have this pervasive fascination with the institution of incarceration. And generations of reformers have pushed up against this institutional barrier, but the prison remains. And I've seen this in my own work. I believe deeply in the rehabilitative ideal, but I don't see this evidenced in institutional incarceration. Rehabilitation does not happen in prison, it happens in spite of prison. And that's what drew me in my interest towards halfway houses. A halfway house is a small residential program focused on parolees. It is a space where they have choice over a number of different development programs, and they are allowed to exercise those choices, sometimes for the first time in decades, and they are transitional in nature. And halfway houses are not a new development. We can trace their origins well into the 19th century, but I see a unique utility in halfway houses, and this is what's driving this research. And there's five items really that make halfway houses worthy of focus on an institutional basis. One, they're residential. There's a number of day programs out there catering for parolees, but researchers have shown that where an inmate, a parolee sleeps, is the strongest indicator of their success. They are parole friendly. They are explicitly focused on people just being released from prison. They're a space where programming and support set the agenda rather than security and control. They are transitional. it's very odd because prisons are this giant institution that thinks very little about transitions. But halfway houses are by definition a transitional space, and most two other significant characteristics for them. It's the only institutional space, literally in the entire criminal justice system, where you can have staff and parolees or staff and clientele working in the same direction. Our Western criminal justice system is explicitly designed on an adversarial model. And yet halfway house, at least on a theoretical level, is a place where both sides have a shared objective. And that leads to the final reason why I believe halfway houses are a rich space for policy innovation and theoretical exploration. They have immense narrative power. You could draw from Weber's concepts of authority here, but prison is the archetypal bureaucratic legal authority. And yet prisoners are organized along charismatic lines. They're organized along traditional lines. They're motivated not by a bureaucratic system, but by story, by narrative. And the prison system has not harnessed this power well. And so with those characteristics of halfway houses in mind, it has led into my research, which I would characterize as an hourglass form. I actually had a picture of it. I was going to share screens, but we've all seen an hourglass. So I view my entire research process as starting in a very broad space, coming down to a very narrow place of impact, and then moving broadly again. And each of my three sets of research questions serve to narrow the space to that place of impact. And my three research questions. So first, and there's a literature review that goes with each one of these questions. So the first series of questions is about the historical context. What is the place and purpose of a halfway house in the evolving debate between punishment and rehabilitation? Like I showed with those two quotes at the beginning, this is not a new debate. There is a cycle, an argument, an ongoing debate between these two forces that's rooted in our very social psychology. But we have to understand that context and what these small residential programs can play in that debate. The second set of questions is about the regional context. The Department of Correctional Services here in South Africa has begun an experiment with halfway houses. And I want to know, what are the implications and opportunities of this project for the developing world? Can South Africa provide a meaningful series of case studies to inform a global debate? There is a global debate over incarceration and rehabilitation. And I believe for a number of reasons, South Africa has a unique contribution to that discussion. And so that's my second literature review. And those questions, again, we move from a broad theoretical historical space into a more narrow geographical context, the South African context. Then to move narrower still, I have questions about the social context. On a pragmatic level, how do halfway houses facilitate a prisoner's integration into a new subculture that is often hostile to their release? So now we have arrived at the lived experience of the prisoners themselves. And for me, that is the narrowest part of my hourglass. The point of impact, the fulcrum of this dissertation lies in the prisoner's experience. And for me, that took me deep into the study of ethnography, and specifically prison ethnography. There's another much longer conversation to be had about prison ethnography. It is it is a vitally important field because it is inherently anti-colonial. Like if we're honest about kind of the roots of ethnography and even the roots of sociology writ large, a lot of it was born out of Western curiosity in cultures that were deemed to be exotic. And obviously there's been work done in the past decades to decolonialize those spaces. But prison ministry prison ethnography from its very beginning was developed in conscious rejection of a very Western power structure. It says we're not interested in this total institution and its control. We want to hear from the prisoners themselves. We want their voices to echo through. And that theory of participant observation has led me into a series of interviews across South Africa with prisoners who are in the period of transition. As part of my research, I've created a database of every residential program that's currently hosting parolees in this country. And unfortunately, it's not a long list. But drawing from those case studies, I've been able to sit with staff and current clients and former clients, and I'm still pushing hard to finish those interviews, because drawing from those interviews, I want to establish some comparative principles, some comparative best practices that are both theoretical and practical in nature, that can guide the function, the narrative of a halfway house. One of the challenges of working in an ethnographic space, and this is where we get to the bottom of the hourglass. One of the challenges of working with an ethnographic space is that it is explicitly narrow. It's very focused on one specific subculture, one specific space. But I need a comparative framework to allow me to analyze different halfway houses against each other. And so I've come up with something I'm calling Incarceral choice mapping, which is where I basically track a parolee's experience through this program, and I identify in binary terms, where are their points of decision making? What are all the decisions that a parolee is given on an institutional basis? And then I'm able to make some comparisons between programs. I think at the end of this project, it has a policy ramification, both for South Africa. I've been able to do a review of the Department of Correctional Services in their kind of informal white paper on halfway houses. That hasn't been studied on a scholarly level yet, so it's been fun to sink my teeth into that. And then also I have some practical reform proposals for the Department of Correctional Services in their correctional sentence plans and how those programs work or more frequently do not work. So it has been a privilege to be on this journey for a long time now. And I would not be here without Professor van der Spey and her guidance and her patience with my long and meandering journey through South Africa's correctional system. So I'm very grateful to her. And when this project finishes this year, it will be a credit to her discipline as much as mine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and well within your time, which I appreciate. Kelly.
After all these months of being on Teams, and yet somehow the mute button never quite unmutes as one wishes it to. Hi, colleagues. It's nice to see all of you. And Andrew, thank you for giving me the opportunity to listen to your talk, which I think was very interesting for all of us. So I'm going to use a structure that we use at the Law and Society in Africa Early Career Scholars Workshop, and which I think has worked really well for us over the years. And so I'm going to shamelessly adopt it for my feedback on your presentation here. And so what we ask, in the workshop, we pair individual early career scholars up with a mentor, and they give a presentation, and then we ask the mentor to restate what they think they've heard. And often hearing somebody else talk about your own paper, summarize it, gives you a view into what other people hear. So I'm going to tell you what I think is the central puzzle that Andrew is trying to resolve with his PhD, what his main argument is, the conversation he wants to be in terms of the kind of wider scholarly literature. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some critiques or comments that I might have.
Thank you.
So I think, Andrew, you set out very well for us that the central puzzle is this fascination with this institution of the prison, right? And the schism between what happens in incarceration and this idea of rehabilitation, that we send people to this carceral space in the hopes that they're going to be rehabilitated, and yet there's this just massive divide that separates those two spaces and ideas. You are drawn to the halfway house as a transitional space, as a space that sits between being inside and being outside, and as a space that has enormous potential for being able to bridge those two very different places. And so your central argument, I think, that as I hear it, is that we should be harnessing the potential, and you call it both the policy potential and the individual impact potential. Those are my words, but kind of a description of what I hear from you, because these spaces are particularly unique in that they're residential. They give parolees a place to exist or to be. They're transitional in that they span a transition, a change in status, in place, in all kinds of things between inside and outside, that they have the opportunity for supportive programming and interaction that can happen within that space, and that you talk about the fact that staff and clients are, as you say, working in the same direction, right? This is one place where everybody is kind of motivated towards the same goal. And so you're trying to ask these questions. The conversation you want to be in is around what is the policy place of the halfway house and how do we best maximize it. I think the other conversation you want to be in is kind of in the regional incarceration question. In other words, as a programmatic intervention, how do these halfway houses work, and how can we make those lessons relevant to other prisons on the continent, perhaps in the southern conversations and elsewhere. And then you come to I think you also hint at an important question that's a methods question, right? Which is a question about how do we do this, right? What does it mean to do participant work with people in these spaces? What does it mean to do ethnography? How can we use these tools to kind of undo some of the colonial legacies of imprisonment, incarceration, criminal justice, those kinds of questions? So I think you've set the stage for us well in understanding why your question matters, right? We can quite clearly answer the so what question. We can understand from a policy perspective. We can understand from a kind of prison theory perspective, a punishment perspective, perhaps even a punishment and human rights kind of conversation that you may want to be in. So I think you situated all of this very well. You also talk about the narrative power, right? About the ways in which prisoners are motivated by narratives and stories, okay? And the enormous potential that exists in these for work, for the goals, for meeting the goals that you want to see happen in these spaces. And then you leave us there, right? And so this is my main critique of the presentation that you've given to us today. is that we know nothing of the narratives, right? You tell us that you've done a certain number of interviews, that you have been in participant in observations, that you've done policy reviews. You kind of you hint at so much, and yet you give us these results, but you give us no results, right? We don't see a single story from an interviewee. We don't see a table that comes from your policy analysis of, what DCS says that they have and what you actually find in the halfway houses. You don't give us a comparative table that says the halfway houses you've looked at, have the following: 10 beds, 3 beds, 25 beds, right? A kind of a texture for us of what the differences between and among these facilities are. So for me, my main critique of your presentation is that I would like you to centralize your own research, right? Start finding some what's the word I'm looking for? Some confidence in your own data, and in the fact that your data tells a story that we need to hear and understand for you to be able to do all of those things that you tell us you're aiming to do, right? And I think it's a very normal and very vulnerabilizing sensation of sitting at the point where you are, right? Where you have all of this data, but it doesn't yet feel completely fully formed or, fancy enough to be in a presentation. But the thing that moves it from sitting as a story in your head to actually being on a screen, on a presentation, on a talk, in a narrative, in a way that moves us as an audience, is that we need to be able to see and hear it, right? We need to allow you to show us your data so that we can be convinced of the things that you see. And so I think if I were to give you a tip that you may consider for doing a presentation of this kind in the future, would be to turn your whole presentation around, right? Is to start with what you have that nobody else has. To start building a sense of understanding among your listeners, your readers, of what you've done to answer your questions, and then what that data shows, and then take us from there. I mean, I love your hourglass analogy. I use it in my own class teaching all the time. But an hourglass is two-sided. You can really put it either way up. And so I'm encouraging you to kind of flip it around a little bit, right? And to say to us, this is what I'm showing you. And now I'm going to show you the actual texture. And what I want you to see from that is how this gives us an insight into all of these conversations. So bring us into those rooms that you've sat in, into the conversations. Show us what you have, and then show us the so what question. Answer the so what question for us. And I think that in doing that, it really, I found this idea of the narrative power of a halfway house really interesting. But I don't really know anything more about what that means, other than to be able to summarize point number 5 for you, and that you tell me that prisoners are motivated by narratives and stories. Now, having worked in women's prisons myself, I can kind of fill in the blanks of why what I think you're saying about why that's important. But I would love to know more about that, about the ways in which you theorize and understand that. And then how you think that helps us in understanding these kind of policy and individual impacts. Leo has given me the 2-minute warning. And so I think the other thing that I would say to you is that I think it's very difficult as somebody who works in the space and who is an activist for change in that space to kind of sometimes separate out the PhD objectives, which is about building knowledge and theory, and the policy objectives, which is about showing DCS what they need to do to change, right? And I think that if you're able to hang your activist coat on the hook for a minute and stay in your PhD coat, I think it will be easier for you to explain to us all of the ways in which what you have builds knowledge and shows us something different about the ways in which we understand that space between incarceration and what happens on the outside. And I think you have a real contribution to make there. The stuff that comes after that is the policy brief that you're going to write for DCS to tell them what they need to do to change, right? Those are the kind of socially responsive add-ons that come from a PhD. But I think let your argument shine, let your theory building shine, let your data shine. And then I think that from an academic presentation perspective, I think you'll be doing really well. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kelly. Andrew, we can give you a little sliver of time to respond to Kelly, if you wish.
Well, I was recording those comments, and I will. Yeah, that's treasure. And maybe just to end, I'll give you guys a picture of one of those conversations, and it's the one that started it all for me. It was with an ex-prisoner from a maximum security prison, and he was describing a time when the prison gangs wanted to punish a particular officer, and it was a dog handler. And if any of you guys have seen a prison dog, you know what they look like. And the gangs they called up 3 of their soldiers, and they gave one soldier a knife to go after the guard, but they gave the other 2 prisoners a blanket, and their job was to jump onto the dog. And again, if you've ever seen a police dog or a prison dog, the idea of jumping on top of one of those animals with a blanket is terrifying. But as I was talking to these guys, I realized, like, this man, he's not a sociopath. He's not doing this out of some love of violence. These were soldiers who received an instruction, and they knew that if I follow this, I'm going to gain this and this privilege and this rank, and they had the story, and that story was so powerful. It was willing to drive them to jump on top of a dog with a blanket, and that got me thinking. Like, we have done such a disservice to these prisoners because there is no story that gets them out of prison. Like, if we had even a narrow pathway out of the total institution, there are prisoners like this guy with the blanket who would move heaven and earth to follow that path. And when I realized how rational and how driven the prisoners I was speaking with were, and how absent there was any kind of a meaningful path out of prison, that's what made me really interested in halfway houses and started this project. And I hope if you'd like to read the conclusion someday, Kelly, I hope I'll be able to speak to some of the larger significances and principles and stories that flow from this space. But thank you so much for the critique. I want more.
Thanks very much, both of you. I think for now, at least, we better move on to Matthew, who, so Matthew, you got 20 minutes to talk about counterterrorism financing regimes and Boko Haram. Thanks. I think you need to unmute, Matthew.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfectly.
All right. I think I should be finishing by 24 minutes past 1, I guess. All right. I don't know whether Gabby can share my slides.
I can. I will do so. Give me one.
Okay. While she does that, my research is okay. The title of my research or my thesis is Institutional Responses to Counter-Terrorism Financing Regime a case study of the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria. Of course, I've been supervised by Professor Irina and Professor Kathleen, and I really want to appreciate them for their inputs and guidance so far. Next slide, please. And so the basis for this research has a lot to do with where the world is right now in terms of counterterrorism, where we are. First of all, the recent rise of the Taliban back to political power and control, 20 years after 9/11, 20 years after the entire world moved into Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, to institutionalize counterterrorism framework and to put an end to terrorism, where George Bush called the axis of evil. 20 years after, Taliban has risen back to political control of the entire Afghanistan, which means every effort to counter terrorism appears to have failed. Meanwhile, within this period, in the last 7 to 8 years, the Taliban has been the most dangerous terrorist organization in the world, followed by ISIS. ISIS, on the other hand, about 3, 4, 5 years ago, was in control of the entire Iraq. Now, that brings the question to the third most dangerous terrorist organization in the world, which is Boko Haram. Is there a tendency now that just as ISIS and Taliban, that Boko Haram also will rise to political control, and the counterterrorism effort in Nigeria may not be able to contain the Boko Haram? So that brings a lot of focus to terrorism in West Africa. Next slide, please. And so the entire focus of this study aimed to explore the Boko Haram insurgency in order to examine counterterrorism financing regimes and how are we proceeding on this. Next slide. Now, the study therefore considers the combined effort of domestic institutions and multilateral organizations in containing the Boko Haram sect access to funding and the underlying influences impacting the efforts. Now, this is because all counterterrorism financing regimes, because of the fact that terrorism is a global problem, they have the multilateral components and they have the domestic actions. And these two components, these two areas, both domestic and multilateral, have to come together to be able to implement CTF regimes that are able to contain the flow of funding. And next slide, to terrorist organizations. Next slide, please. Now, the study is premised on the assumption that since terrorist financing is central to the growing wave of global terrorism, unfunding terror has been at the heart of the global war on terror. As international stakeholders, in collaboration with domestic actors, seek to identify and stifle funding sources exploited by terrorist organizations. Next slide, please. Therefore, the primary research question is this: what are the formative influences shaping the implementation of counter-terrorism financing regimes against the financing of terrorism in Nigeria, with specific reference to the Boko Haram insurgency? In other words, in the implementation of counter-terrorism financing regimes, there are formative factors. Since we have actors at domestic level and multilateral actors, there are formative influences that is impacting these institutions in implementing counter-terrorism financing regimes at the domestic level and as well as the global level. Go ahead, next slide, please. So the theoretical argument, first of all, at the domestic level, taken from the work of Michael Ball in his book, Non-Western Responses to Counterterrorism, he identified 4 major factors that sum up the entire factors that influence the implementation of CTF regimes at the domestic level. And these 4 factors are the historical experiences of war, corruption, occupation, and colonialism, local politics and the distribution of power amongst domestic stakeholders, internal religious division or debate amongst key sectarian communities, and cultural tradition and experiences. Now, in his argument, which is out there very strongly, is that no matter how we look at the factors that are affecting how the functionality of CTF regimes at the local level, at the policy level, at the domestic level, these 4 areas tends to encapsulate or covers them all. Next slide, please. At the multilateral level, the theoretical arguments borders on the work of Romanik in 2010. He identified three major issues that impact multilateral actions when it comes to counterterrorism. First of all, he looked at three different schools of thought: the realists, the liberalists, and the constructionists. And the realists, they think that counterterrorism cooperation or multilateral cooperation are avenues for a hegemon group of powerful nations to impose their will on weaker states. The liberals advocate that the beneficial relationship between powerful and weaker states should be the basis for joint multilateral action. Then the constructionists look at multilateral cooperation derives from shared principles and existing understanding amongst members of an international political order, such as the United Nations. So, for instance, now Nigeria is part of a lot of international bodies, and so multilateral action flows from that direction. But also, there are also bigger nations like United States and United Kingdom that have different, counterterrorism programs in Nigeria. Now, the realists have an argument to that. Next slide, please. Now, domestic institutions of interest. These are the institutions that have been mandated by the Terrorism Prevention Act, to be in charge of counterterrorism in Nigeria. Now, these institutions are the National Financial Intelligence, Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, Economic Financial Crimes Commission, Department of State Services, Nigerian Army, the Central Bank, and the Attorney General's Office. Now, at the multilateral level, the institutions of interest that have had direct dealing with effort to contain terrorism in Nigeria are the United Nations Security Council through their various resolutions, the United Nations Counterterrorism Committee, the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, and the Financial Action Task Force, the government of the UK, Canada, and EU, and the AU and ECOWAS through GIABA. Next slide, please. Now, so the work generally is, the approach is identifying the basic research questions that provide the scope for the study. So by attempting to review literature in order to generate the required themes, we looked at the different research questions that are of interest. Number one, research question, aim to conceptualize terrorism in the light of various extremist violence in Nigeria, the Boko Haram insurgency, in the light of various extremist violence in Nigeria. For instance, there is a sharp difference between difference between Boko Haram insurgency, of course, and Niger Delta militancy, Boko Haram insurgency and banditry, Boko Haram insurgency and headers. So we need to conceptualize that in the context of this research to know exactly what particular, aspects that is the research is focusing on. The second research question is looking at the issue of funding and looking at the CTF regimes in generally. It said, is Boko Haram managing to circumvent CTF regimes? If yes, how is the sect managing to do so? That is a key question that we need to find out. So to answer the question, for instance, this study attempt to identify the sources of funding most crucial to the Boko Haram sect, such that if CTF regimes are effective in stifling the flow of funding through these sources, the Boko Haram insurgency will be contained and possibly bring to an end. Next slide, please. Now, to answer this question, I'm just giving instance on how we proceed in dealing with each of our questions. To answer this question, the study begins by reviewing historical facts linking Boko Haram takeoff to the sum of 1.8 million pounds made available by Osama bin Laden in 2003 for Al-Qaeda to establish a formidable presence in northern Nigeria. So this is the first major international funding that came to the Boko Haram sect from what literature already have. And so we're looking at it now. The first question is, in reviewing and from what we have so far and interactions, we realized that Al-Qaeda exploited Nigeria's informal economy and outright lack of regulatory frameworks against terrorism financing to bring in this money. Another issue has to do with the failure of United States African Contingent Operations Training and Assistance Program to achieve set objectives. Next slide, please. So we have all these other questions that tend to identify the various aspects of the study is going to look at. And of course, those form the aspect of the literature that the the presentation is all about. Next slide, please. Now, at the end of the day, there are key projections that the study is looking into. That the institutional effort to contain the rise of the Boko Haram insurgency is one of those. The collaboration between global stakeholders and the federal government of Nigeria in containing Boko Haram insurgency, and of course, factors impacting the legislative framework, including prosecution of terrorist financing suspects, as well as issues on human rights and citizens' rights. Next slide, please. And next slide. Just move further. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Did I go too far?
No, you are fine. Just go to the next slide.
Thanks.
Okay, please, can you go back a little? Just go back one more step. Of course, other key things that the study is looking at is the level of competence and professionalism of lead agencies in the implementation of CTF regime. So these are the things that I believe that at the end of the day, the 10 factors that the study is going to achieve at the end of the day. Next slide. Now, to achieve this, we're conducting so far I'm conducting some structured interviews with policy elites with functional knowledge of the DSS, EFCC, NFIU, Nigerian Army, Central Bank of Nigeria, and Office of the Attorney General, and the constitutional efforts of this agency in implementing CTF regimes. So, and the policy elites that were interviewing so far include some of them have headed some of these agencies before, and some of them have played some strategic role. So they are giving us the facts of how they have proceeded in implementing CTF regimes in the last 11 or 12 years of the Boko Haram insurgency, and what are the key issues that are of interest to us so far. Also, interview of policy experts at the UNDOC who are directly involved in engaging the federal government of Nigeria. At least I have 2 persons already they are engaging, and they have been involved directly from the UNDOC in implementing multilateral measures. And they have given their own overview of the issues within the Nigerian political space and all that, and the way it is impacting CTF regimes. But the thing that here is that, the study is exploring working document, bilateral agreements, multilateral actions to identify the nature of diplomacy between Nigerian government and global stakeholders to control the Boko Haram funding, criminal law used for investigation, detention, arrest, extradition, prosecution, and incarceration for crimes related to terrorism, financial controls, including the freezing of assets linked to terrorism, use of military force against terrorist targets, and intelligence and covert actions to contain the flow of terrorist finance. Next slide, please. Of course, we are trying to, we believe in the course of the study that there are a lot of interactions going on here. That within the domestic level, for instance, I've given an example of the issue of funding when it comes to the Boko Haram Sept, how they got their funding, but that is not the only sources of funding. Of course, we have the issue of taxing, we have the issue of attacking, because in the concept of this study, we are going to conceptualize finance. Finance doesn't just mean cash. Finance means logistics. You know, the Boko Haram attack military formations and get arms and all that. These are also forms of finance that aid their further attacks. So we are looking at the broad issue of financing. So the finance is going to be conceptualized. But we are saying now, for instance, that there is a lot of social networking or interaction going on. Let me give an example. When in 2001, after the 9/11 attack, and on the 28th of September, that's about 20 years ago today, the United Nations General Assembly passed the resolution 1373, I guess. And in trying to implement that resolution in Nigeria, the National Assembly in Nigeria were divided between the North and the South. They said that resolution, if it is implemented in Nigeria, is going to affect the interests of Northern Nigeria. And so the entire National Assembly voted down on that resolution, and that resolution was not passed between 2001, 2002, 2003, until 2005. So we believe that there is this interaction going on between this resolution when they come from global stakeholders and attempts to implement them there. In that case, a political factor play a key role in stopping that resolution from coming into effect. The analytical framework explores, of course, the social network analysis to identify the key players in the social interactions regarding the implementation of CTF regimes and to explain policy convergence and investigate the underlying issues informing security preferences aimed at containing the flow of funding to the Boko Haram terrorist organization. Next slide, please.
So just to warn you, you've got 4 minutes left, just in case if you haven't seen the chat.
Yeah, okay, 4. Yeah, I'm done already. I'm done. So,
okay.
So we, in the whole basis of the research, we are looking at both issues that pertains to domestic level that are impacting the CTF regimes and issues that border on the multilateral, level that also impacts. There are various things that we intend to consider. Let me give another example of multilateral actions. For instance, the United Kingdom, because in one of the theories that talk about the realist, one of the things we discovered is that even multilateral agencies or international bodies, their efforts in counterterrorism regimes implementation and design of CTF regimes are influenced by a lot of factors, personal interests, strategic interests, and there's this argument between multilateral agencies. For instance, the British government announced in 2010 that they are investing or sending out £8 million, for the counterterrorism effort in Nigeria. Now, eventually, the details came out that the money was actually used to protect the British oil interest in the Niger Delta. So even though the money was released from the House of Commons for counterterrorism purposes, but it was, diverted, there are full literature on that to another purpose. So what we are saying is that their interest in Nigeria is maybe at that point in time influence the CTF, the multilateral measures that they took. So in all, this study is looking at domestic factors and the interactions between domestic factors and how they are affecting the implementation of CTF regimes, how they affect the appointment even of heads of particular organizations that that implement CTF regimes. The interplay of these things are on one hand, and on the other hand also, we have the issue of global actors, their various interests, their divisions. Let me give another example. In 2011, I think I have just 2 minutes more. In 2011, after the attack on the United Nations headquarters, the United Nations went ahead and proceeded to proscribe the Boko Haram as a terrorist organization, foreign terrorist organization. The United States didn't do that for another 3 years. Why? Now, so far, the interaction with some key actors that we have engaged so far said that politicians from Nigeria moved to the US Congress in the US and lobby. And in the course of lobbying, that influenced the action of the US government, for instance, in proscribing, because an election was coming the following year. So what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of interplay of interests at the global level and at the domestic level, and that is affecting the implementation of CTF regimes. Identifying those factors and how those factors are affecting the implementation of CTF regimes in general is the key purpose of the study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew. Really interesting. And thanks, Gabby, also for your role. Kelly, your 10 minutes starts now.
Thank you. So I must give a special note of thanks to Chepo for giving somebody who works on violence against women and law reform a paper on counterterrorism financing to critique. But I think actually that, I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, in part because I think that when somebody completely outside of your environment speaks to your paper, sometimes it distills down for you how well you've been able to convey some of those concepts across, right? And I think that really should be one of our goals in presentations like these, is to speak both to the people who are in your conversation in the room and people who are not usually in your conversation in the room, right? To try and draw them in and to find connection. So let me see how well I do with this. It's a test for you and a test for me, Matthew. So thank you, Matthew, for that. So I think that the central puzzle that Matthew is trying to help us to understand is how well or how at all counterterrorism financing kind of structures, restrictions operate in controlling terrorist organizations like Boko Haram? And if we were to take that a little bit further, how are Boko Haram managing to circumvent these structures or mechanisms that are in place supposedly to control them? And I think that the central argument that you're making, Matthew, is that both domestic and international multilateral institutions or factors that are at play in both of those spaces matter, and that they have to work together if we really want to address terrorism financing, right? And of course, both of these spheres are really important in understanding how that happens, because each of those spheres are shaped by forces, so therefore both at the domestic and the international level, right? There's stuff going on in both of those spaces that impact on the success or the failure of the mechanisms that we might be put in place. What I think you're doing, and I think this comes to the conversation that you're trying to be in, the intellectual or academic conversation, I think you're doing some kind of a test of Boyle's theory, right? That identifies those 4 factors that you identified or that you mentioned on the slide, being that history matters, politics matter, ethno-religious features or factors matter, and legal structures matter, right? And although you didn't scope it in this way, as I understood what you're doing, is you want to see how well Boyle's features, and perhaps you're proposing that there may be some factors from one of your other authors that may speak into some of the gaps. But in fact, this is a test of a theory. You're trying to say, in this particular instance, with this particular group, do these 4 factors broadly explain what's happened here? In other words, can we use Boyle really to understand? You provide us with 10 projections, and for me, moving kind of into critique, this is where things in your presentation are a little harder to follow, right? You have some research questions, you have 10 projections on 2 slides, and first of all, you blistered through them at the speed of light, which means that you don't give your reader or your audience enough time to actually read and follow along with those projections, right? While I can properly summarize, I hope, some of your previous slides, those 2 slides are a little bit of a mystery to me, right? And so I'm left asking, are these projections hypotheses that you're proposing? In other words, based on the literature, you would expect that these 10 things would be happening. In some ways, it sounded to me like you might be proposing these as tests. In other words, that you wanted to see whether these 10 factors are present or not. And so I suppose that leads me to my main critique, which is that it's very difficult from that point onwards in your presentation to identify what the focus is of what you're planning to do, right? Thank you, Leo. So in other words, what is the key argument that you're making? What is the main takeaway that you want me to have understood at the end of the presentation? What is the key contribution that this study makes to our understanding of these issues of counterterrorism financing and the ways in which, in the case of Boko Haram, these come together in a particular way? And so I would really encourage you to think carefully about those projections, right? Whether they are in fact testable hypotheses that come out of theory, and if so, what you're going to do to test them. And I suppose linked to that, you mentioned social network analysis, but it's entirely unclear to me how that is linked to the other goals or hypotheses, activities that I think you set out in the preceding slides. So I think, and this is always a danger of trying to fit a really large PhD into a very small presentation, is that I think you need to think carefully about what the focus is. it's impossible to put 85,000 words into one presentation. And so I think we always have to make strategic choices on which part of the story we want to show to our particular audience, right? And then, much like I said to Andrew, as your participant or your audience, I want to see the systematic evidence that you build in respect of that one part of your argument, right? Or the two parts of your argument. So I would have liked to have seen some of the findings from even preliminary activities that you've already done. You seem to have done some policy analysis. You've tried to understand kind of events that have happened in as part of the sphere or the space. So I would have liked to see how you build your evidence that leads you to understand that kind of intersecting Venn diagram in the way that you present. So for me, my key critique here will be for you to think carefully about what activities you need to do. I think this is always one of the risks as we go deeper and deeper into the PhD. We see more and more kind of dark recesses in the caves of our question that we know with just a little bit more work, we could probably do something on that. And I would really encourage you to kind of pull back as hard as it is from some of those deep recesses of your caves so that you can answer your key question really well, so that your reader knows what your key question is, and so that your reader follows and understands the contribution that you make in understanding that piece of the puzzle. And I think that one of the most helpful things, Tsepo said we must all acknowledge our supervisors. So I'm going to acknowledge my supervisor, Brian Forst, who said to me at one point, he said, you need to remember that your PhD is not the last piece of research that you're ever going to do. It's probably one of the first real pieces of research that you're ever going to do. And it's okay for it only to address part of the spectrum of things that you identify as important. That we need to see PhDs as the first step on a long career in which we can eventually get to all of those 2 slides of 10 projections, Matthew, right? But that we need to pick which ones we want to focus on in this piece of work and really do them justice. Now, of course, that makes it seem like it's easy to do those things, and inevitably we have to kind of turn away from things we think are super important. But I think it's really important to be able to do justice to your work, to your field work, to your analysis, to the building of evidence, and to making your argument clear for your reader in the 85,000 words that you have available. And so that, I think, would be my key pointer for continuing to work on this piece. Thanks, Matthew. And
thanks so much, Kelly. Yeah, I agree with that. I thought with my PhD I was going to solve the whole field in one go, but it took a while to be talked down to the position that I was just going to set out some questions and maybe answer one tiny one, and the rest that could be for the rest of my career. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. Matthew, we can give you just no more than 2 minutes to respond quickly.
Okay, I guess one of the things that Dr. Kelly looked at were the 10 projections. Well, I couldn't go through the sub-research questions, each and every one of them. Those projections were the things I was expecting to come out of the research questions. It's just even the summary of the sub-research questions are the things that are going to come at the end of the day. So I don't think, and each of those things are divided into what is happening at the global level and what is happening at the domestic level. That is what my research is all about. So we're looking at the formative factors that are affecting what happened at the global level and at the domestic level. So those 10 things are coming out of the sub-research questions. At this point also, because of the time, I will not be able to say what I found in the field so far. I will just give you 20 minutes to talk about my research in a jiffy. So I agree with the things you have raised, and I've tried as much as possible to limit myself within. There's a temptation always to go off board, but I really take into heart your observation. And I want to say thank you very much for for that, and I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much.
Can I abuse the power of discussion for 1 second, Leo? Just to note that a 20-minute presentation at a conference is a huge luxury, right? You usually get 10, 12, maybe 15 minutes, right? So this developing the skill, and this is as true for me as it is for everyone else in this room, developing the skill of knowing what can fit into how to show your contribution in a short presentation in a way that makes me want to go and find your whole dissertation is what you're trying to do, rather than what I think many of us do is try to do so much of the groundwork that we don't ever get to our own contribution. And so I'm not wanting to go and look for Obonyelo on the dissertation library shelves, right? So it's about finding that balance. And I think that's, it kind of goes across the critique with Andrew.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kelly, and thanks again, Matthew. Now it's we're going to hear from Annie on cash and transit crime. Annie, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research, and congratulations to all the other speakers. I found your presentations very informative and interesting. Hopefully I'll do justice to this topic and not just rush through the groundwork. So my research looks at cash and transit robberies through a network lens, and Professor Aurena van der Spey very patiently supervises this research. Today, I hope to show you a bit of what I'm doing and to share some initial results and where I am in the journey without going into too much detail about the methodology. So cash and transit robberies, well, a cash and transit robbery rather, refers to an incident in which a member of a security company are robbed while transporting cash for clients. So when considering the number of CIT robberies in the past 20 or so years, 3 periods stand out. The initial period from 2001 to 2005 is quite volatile, which can probably be ascribed to reporting inconsistencies. To give you an example, during these earlier years, there was an incident where a taxi passenger was robbed of his money. The police recorded the incident as a cash and transit robbery because A, money was robbed, and B, in transit. So that obviously equals cash and transit robbery. There has been a consistent decrease in incidents from 2005 to 2015, but it has been gradually increasing since, despite the lockdown distortion. Interestingly, the fluctuating nature of the robberies is mainly ascribed to high-density police operations. But regardless of the frequency, this form of crime results in serious harms, and it constitutes both a physical and economic threat. During the 2019-2020 year, 33% of on-the-road attacks were perpetrated with bombs, while 98% of cross-pavement CIT robberies involved a firearm. The annual economic loss is not publicly available, but SABRIC reported monthly losses ranging in the tens of millions during the 2019-2020 financial year. I think it's fair to say that cash and transit robberies constitute a pressing challenge that definitely justifies further exploration. So this here is not a selection of literature. It is in fact a complete reference list of all cash and transit robbery literature, at least English and Afrikaans. So you'll notice that the colored citations are related work in the South African side. The blue articles are based on a master's thesis, and it involved interviews with 40 incarcerated offenders. The green articles are based on a PhD thesis that included interviews with 21 incarcerated offenders. These were conducted during more or less the same period, during 2014, so they probably interviewed the same people. The seminal piece for cash and transit literature is the red highlighted article, and it's based on Gill's widely cited article, about the craft of cash and transit robbers. And almost all cash and transit literature can be traced back to this piece. So the lack of research on this subject implies an extensive scope to enhance knowledge in the field. The literature covers the fundamentals. It can be roughly divided into 5 themes. The first discusses cash and transit robberies and its facilitators. The second reviews the skills and characteristics of CIT robbers. The third theme considers the geospatial details, such as concentration and location of incidents and how the target is selected. The fourth couples investigative techniques and preventative measures, which also includes pattern of CIT robberies, while the fifth and final theme is focused on the risk and harms associated with CIT robberies and the implication of the continued threat. So this study is the first to consider CIT robberies through a network criminology lens, and will also be the first to analyze a cash and transit criminal network. So CIT robberies are regarded as highly organized in nature, but we don't yet understand what that means at the network level. So therefore, this research is interested in what characterizes a CIT criminal network. So my primary objective is to map an empirical network on 3 levels: the overall network structure, at a community level, and at an individual node level. The second objective is to create a crime script of the case study to scrutinize the crime commission process. The third objective, which has been the most challenging so far, is to have a conversation with industry and police about their understanding of cash and transit syndicates and how it compares to the empirical network, what methods they use to investigate CIT crimes, and their opinion about the utility of network analysis as a method. So this research is an applied criminology study. It's explorative in its approach, and it relies on both theory and method, but the value lies in the application of the method to empirical data, with the hope of providing a more nuanced view of the phenomenon. The empirical data is extracted from a court judgment involving 2 cash and transit vehicles that were simultaneously ambushed and attacked about 30 kilometers apart on a stretch of highway in KwaZulu-Natal. What makes it interesting is that it involved 2 separate incidents, one successful, the other aborted. And cell phone records were instrumental in building the case, which lends itself very well to network analysis. By the way, there are broadly 2 types of cash and transit robberies. AV, where an armored vehicle is targeted while on the road, as is the case in my particular case study, as opposed to cross-pavement robberies, where the money is intercepted on the way to or from the armored vehicle. So some of the information that I extracted from this case includes cell phone contacts, information about contact lists, and long-term acquaintances. We're also currently in the process of trying to access the case study police docket for a more nuanced information. So this research combines social network analysis and crime script analysis with interviews. Script analysis, in essence, deconstructs a sequence of events to highlight the procedural nature of crime. The objective is that by identifying the individual steps involved to commit an offense, one could highlight potential opportunities to prevent, reduce, or disrupt crime. My aim here is to create a hypothetical CIT robbery script based on the current literature and a reactive script based on the empirical data. So you'll remember that my case study involves a successful and aborted incident. So it offers 2 perspectives of how a cash and transit robbery could potentially play out. So I'll compare the empirical script with the hypothetical script to determine to what extent the theoretical matches what actually happens on the ground. So as human beings, we have a very limited capacity to process wider complexities. And network analysis is a powerful method to make sense of complex information. It allows us to declutter information about relations, interdependencies, influence, flows in a network. So it's a discipline with its own theories, methods, and statistical applications. You don't, for instance, need big data to do sensible analysis. And therefore, with all this combined, my aim is to shift the current perspective on cash and transit robberies with a network approach to perhaps find new information about the phenomenon. And this is just a small, a bit of the results. It's a representation of the empirical network after the robbery was committed. So it's the final movement in the crime process, in the crime commission process, and it's only a small part of the entire crime script. It is based on cell phone calls made to and from the accused within more or less a 4-hour period. And in total, there are 752 calls made on the day of the robbery. To give you a breakdown of what you're seeing here, a node can represent a person, event, or an entity, while a link refers to the connection between two nodes. It's represented by the blue lines. The orange nodes represent the actual accused. The green nodes represent their associates who were not tried but involved in some way. And the purple nodes represent the accused's eco-network. So these were considered irrelevant to the investigation, and I unfortunately have no insight into how or why certain nodes were considered unimportant. The size of the node is calculated based on their betweener centrality, which basically highlights the brokers of the network, revealing much about the flow of information between the nodes. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that I'm analyzing the empirical network at 3 levels. This is the first level. It's a macro analysis of the network structure, which entails a statistical description of the network. In short, there are 143 individuals with 323 links between them. I'll skip over most of this in the interest of time, but what is interesting is the clustering coefficient here, showing that 57% of the group is clustered. And also interesting is the Eigenvector Centrality, which looks at the influence people have over the network. The score is pretty high at 80%, which shows that certain people have influence over the network, more so than others. And based on this, communities matter in the network, and there are clearly influences. Which takes us to the second level of analysis, a macro level analysis of communities within the network. So a modularity score goes from -1 to 1. If you're close to 1, as in this case, it means that the network is not random and it's more clustered, meaning dense connections within communities, but sparse connection between communities. So far, the node area of residence seems to be the strongest predictor of link between the nodes, but it's not striking. Then the final level of analysis is at the node level. So it shows the most important nodes based on 4 definitions of importance, and that is determined by their position in the network. So degree centrality is the average number of connections, and it shows popularity. Eigenvector centrality shows how well-connected nodes are to well-connected others, which shows influence. Betweener centrality shows who brokers relations in the network or bridging the clusters. And then closeness just shows how close is the nodes to the rest of the network. And just based on this, the police would have done very well to focus their investigation on these individuals, especially 22 and 19. So mapping a network reveals much about the links between nodes, whilst a script can shape the network according to the condition of the robbery. So this allows me to essentially match nodes by partitioning the network data by time and location to the actions required in the execution of each scene as identified by the crime script analysis. And based on this and the descriptions contained in the court judgment, I created a geographical map which will be used in combination with network analysis and the crime script to hopefully reveal insights about the roles and influence of individual nodes during the various phases of the robbery. So the bulk of the work was probably preparing the data, and now I must finalize the analysis and hopefully conduct a few interviews. The final network model will determine the most appropriate theory, which will be integrated with criminological theories to explain the underlying mechanisms that influence and shape the network. So in summary, social network analysis is a powerful method to make sense of networks involved in organized crime, and it has many other applications as well, but it takes time to learn the method and the applications, and it also has shortcomings. What I've shown here is just small snippets of a single instance, but the method can be applied on a much larger scale to hopefully contribute to the current understanding and discussion about perhaps disruption and containment efforts. So unfortunately, I didn't go into too much detail, so it's still very much a work in progress, and it only offers broad strokes of what I've been doing. But I think it's appropriate to mention that I have encountered significant obstacles. Not only is this type of research very time-consuming, very messy, and it requires significant software skills in terms of both data management and analysis. The visualizations is very nifty, but it's not always useful. So you need to know how to interpret the results for true meaning, which relies on both subject and domain knowledge. And I've also had to adapt along the way. I'm currently trying to get a finalized police docket whilst I wait for the go-ahead to conduct interviews with the Hawks members. And in fact, I'm celebrating my application's first birthday next month, so there's that. So with all this in mind, I've learned that a lack of understanding and a few challenges should not prevent research, should motivate it. So thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, we note that you cut out some of the detail from your presentation for reasons of time. So thank you for that. Kelly.
Thank you. So thank you, Annie, for the opportunity to comment. It's always really so amazing to see how far people have come. I mean, Annie came and chatted to me about social network analysis. How long ago, Annie? 2-3 years ago now. And was just kind of starting out. So to see the ways in which you've been able to make sense of the method, the ways in which you've been able to summarize the data, work with the data, produce a network analysis is really amazing. So I heartily applaud you for that. So what I think the central puzzle is that Annie's presenting us is the fact that cash in transit robberies are a dangerous and costly problem, regardless of how we can look at the stats and smooth them out or deepen them, whichever, we have relatively high numbers of them, and yet we know little about this, right? Either internationally or from a South African focus. And so Annie's making the argument that we should be concerned about this because they are an incident or a kind of crime that has a lot of economic consequence as well as consequences for people. And I think her argument that she's trying to make is that if we can better understand our networks and how the crime unfolds, we will know more about cash in transit robberies as a kind of predatory action. And that if we can understand the ways in which the police understand policing and lay those two things over each other, we should be able to see how well our policing initiatives are actually mapping what we know about the crime. And so I think that also clearly helps us to answer the so what question. In other words, why should we care about another cash in transit robbery study? And of course, the conversation I think you want to be in, Annie, is in properly understanding particular crime types and doing the kind of deep work that is required to be able to do so, but also in how do we add to the conversation of this kind of crime in South Africa and beyond. Certainly, they're not unique to South Africa, and so how do we add our understanding to that? And I think that's where I'd like to probably start my critique, is that, I mean, it's I think probably simultaneously wonderful, but also a little bit nauseating that you can put your entire literature on one slide, right? Wonderful because you clearly have a gap to be able to intercede into. It's the kind of scholarly gap we all hope to find, but a little bit nauseating because I think we're constantly worrying about whether we've missed something, right? Can it really be that we can fit an entire literature onto one slide within a full title for each, right? And so I suppose that maybe one area where I might suggest that you might want to think, and I don't think it's to completely reshape what you're doing, but perhaps to take a step back and say, what are cash in transit husks an example of? So in other words, are there other criminological concepts or conversations that we may be able to draw from or point to as analogies, as other versions of a similar thing to what is going on here? And I think that an organized crime networks, I think, would be one place that I would suggest there may be analogies that are obvious, but also other kinds of criminal enterprise networks that have been used to understand, have been understood through social network analyses, I think would also be perhaps useful for deepening and extending the ideas and concepts that you may be wanting to draw from eventually, which leaves you a little less thin on that kind of theoretical framing and may also help you to fill in, to draw from other literatures who've tried to understand the ways in which people work in concert with each other or network together, perhaps even in business or other places, to help understand what's going on here, right? So I think there are other literatures that you may want to think about. My second critique or suggestion, I suppose, is to think a little more about what the about how you summarize the theoretical contribution that a descriptive activity makes. So the task of describing a network or describing something isn't generally where we want or where we expect a PhD to end, right? We want a description and a theoretical elevation of that description. So I think you know very well what the theoretical contribution of understanding the network is. And I think you explain it well in showing how understanding the network and the kind of unfolding of the event and policing come together. But I think it would be helpful if you could find a theoretically scoped way of telling me, showing me what that contribution is, because I think it elevates what you're doing or really showcases or shines what you're doing in the way that I think it should be, right? So, so you talk a little bit about where you overlay over your literature slide those 5 brown boxes, right? About the crime, the this, the whatever. I think it's somewhere in there. And so I would encourage you to find a way to state the contribution in those theoretical terms, which I think would take your presentation up to the kind of next level. I think I know the answer to why you haven't spoken very clearly to the limitations of a social network analysis. And it's because it's the weakness of a social network analysis, right? Okay. But I think my other main critique is that you have to go there in a presentation of this nature. Otherwise, you're simply waiting for somebody else to point out all of the reasons why what you've done sits on shaky ground, right? So I, for example, would have really wanted you to tell me why this case, right? Why this particular one? Now, it may be that this is the only one that you have access to, or it's the most comprehensive transcript that you could find. No research is ever perfect, right? And so I think we shy away from owning up to those limitations rather than just saying research is never perfect. This is the one that I have to work with. And these are the reasons why I think we learn something even from this one, right? N of 1 case studies have been enormously useful. Build on that literature, show the places in which single incident case studies have built understanding of organized crime networks, of the ways in which kind of illicit actors rely on licit people within those networks. There's lots of things that you can use to kind of make the case why understanding a single network is important. I think you also have to, if you're going to tell us, if your argument is that understanding this case tells us something, thanks Leo, about how policing and criminals kind of intercede in space, I think you have to address the fact that this case by next year will be 10 years old, right? And that and either make the case that policing in 10 years has actually not changed much, or that regardless of what has changed in policing, that understanding a case like this helps us to understand today's and kind of attention on cash in transit heists in a certain way. So I think that would be part of what's important. I also would have liked to see you talk a little bit more about what's left out, right? And I think, for me, listening to what you said, what is presented in a case that is essentially built on police investigation and prosecutorial understanding of the way in which this crime plays out is what makes it important to understand how the police and the prosecutors pull together this thing that's the case, right? What do they leave in and what do they leave out tells us something about the way in which they understand what's going on here and what they need to try and stop it. But I don't think you fully exploited the kind of critique about where you draw a boundary around a social network, right? So in other words, how do you know when you've listened to enough calls? How do you know when you've tapped enough phones to know where the edge of that network is? Networks are notoriously fuzzy, right? They can be overlapping based on the way that we define events or conversations as either in or out, as important or not important for inclusion into our final data set, has a lot to do with the way that our network looks. I think you have to exploit that to kind of leverage an understanding of the ways in which the criminal justice actors that present this case understand what's going on here, and then try to overlay that with the other things that you bring to the fore. So in short, I think it's fascinating. I think the amount of work you've done is amazing. I think your presentation is nicely built on evidence. The visualizations are fascinating. Of course, I want to zoom in on some of those nodes and see what's going in there. And I think that's the challenge for you as you continue to build the dissertation, is how you pull us into what's going on in those communities, right? And the ways that those communities fit together, how they intersect using the qualitative data from the phone calls. But I think in some, it's a fascinating piece of work that I think quite easily you can just really lift in the way, maybe by thinking of some of the things that I've suggested. Done.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Annie, a few quick words?
Well, firstly, thank you very much. I made a note of everything you said. I think it will definitely help me along the way. And I actually regret not speaking about the boundaries. It's actually quite important to address that. So let me just mention that the boundaries are very clearly set by the actual cell phone calls. So I don't have anything other than that. And there's no way around that. Other than that, Valid points. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to actually listen to this, especially considering that it's the graveyard shift. It's a long day. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks to Andrew and Matthew too. I'm really pleased to know about the fantastic research going on in the faculty. I'm sure others feel the same. But more importantly, I hope that you three have learned from this, found it a useful process in thinking about your own work and building up confidence in presenting it and so on. And thanks, of course, to Kelly for her time and the really incisive but also encouraging comments. I think that closes the session only a few minutes over time. I think, Sept, do you want to tell us what awaits?
Yeah, we were going to announce the best speaker today, but I think it may be more prudent to maybe do it tomorrow or the next day after we've consulted with all colleagues, because we have a bit of a deadlock. I have my choice, but this isn't a dictatorship. I will, before closing, by acknowledging everybody who's contributed towards this, I will ask if Mr. Val from LexisNexis, if she may want to say a word or two. Of course, we are grateful to LexisNexis, who have sponsored a prize worth 1,500 of any of their products. So it's a voucher. And we are really lucky, because this is a pilot inaugural edition. And we'll try again next year and make it bigger and better. But Mr. Val, do you want to say anything?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'll be very brief. It's been extremely interesting listening to everyone. Congratulations on all the good work that you're doing, taking all these interesting questions and writing them up. It was a pleasure for me to listen in. I'm sorry that I couldn't join right at the beginning. And whoever wins the prize, I hope you find an interesting book that can help you in your research and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so a few acknowledgements before we close. A huge thank you to Professor Sandy Patterson, Professor Johan Hatting, who were kind of the initiators of this. I, together with them, worked hard on it. We worked pretty much the whole year to get this thing going, all sorts of things along the way. And I'm very grateful, at least we got through it. You will hold your own view about how it went. I hope you enjoyed it at the very least. And also like to thank members of the Higher Degrees Committee. They gave comments. I see also Professor Salazar is still with us. Professor David Collier, who helped us get the word out and get some people in, encouraging her students to participate. Professor van der Spey, indeed, as well. I think everybody from the last session is her student. So we are so very grateful. And of course, our three discussants, Professor Kelly Molt, very detailed, incisive comments. We also have Dr. Tebelo Tabani, who got us through the first session. Also very good comments. I hope everybody benefited from that. I certainly found them useful. We also had Professor Rochelle Leroux, who carried the house, as it were, because her session was the longest. So there were more commercial law abstracts, than other areas of law. And I also have to thank Professor Mostert, who isn't here, who supported us in her ideas. And of course, the chairs, my dear brother Leo, who could have said, no, I'm too busy, which would have been understood. Also, my sister Numfundo, who chaired the first session, and of course, Elrina chaired the last session. So, big team effort. And of course, Gabby, I initially thought once we've built up the thing, done the planning on the day, it'll just run itself. But there were technical glitches along the way. People's slides had to be moved. There were all sorts of things. So definitely could not have done it without Gabby Ritchie. And I appreciate her for all her help in getting this going, and other things that we are doing, she's getting going. So thank you, everybody, colleagues, and please, all the participants, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free, send me or Gabby an email. We try and go again next year. And for those who have submitted, a big congratulations. I'm sure colleagues in the room will tell you that it's a huge achievement, huge weight off your shoulders. Well, not really. So congratulations. And for those who will be joining us next year again, I hope you do come and participate. And in the event that it is compulsory, we hope to see new work. So I've taken notes of what everyone has done. So no repeat offenders, if you get what I mean. So a big thank you. And Gabby, I don't know if you want to say any last words?
Nothing from me. Thanks, Tepo.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. And Kelly, can I ask you to email me written to you, and then we'll announce it to the world so everybody will know you. Thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.